So, good afternoon, sir. My name is Shaurya Bhaskar. I'm a first year undergraduate student at Ashoka.
Hi, Shaurya.
I'm Shivank, founder of the Investments Club. Thank you
Yeah.
so much for joining us
Thank you
today.
so much for joining us, sir.
Thank you for having me here.
So the first question that we're going to start off with is a question that was crowdfunded by the audience here today. Was that what is the best way for someone who's interested in the markets to start learning about them? Like, do you read, do you watch podcasts, do you watch videos? What do you do? Like,
I have no interest in markets, to be honest. I have interest in businesses. I look at markets only to see whether there is an opportunity to buy, because you're only looking at the market to see what the price is, right? But all the time is spent in analyzing businesses. If you spend your time in markets, you'll have no time for the business. So I don't have CNBC, I don't watch TV, I don't have Bloomberg, none of that stuff. I have annual reports and I would read books written by industry leaders about the particular industry and the struggles they face. I read business biographies. I read about other companies globally, not just in India, which compete with the companies that I'm invested in or might contemplate investing in. I read about all kinds of industries that are much more developed outside India, but which will eventually Indian businesses will also follow the same path. To do that, you have to stay away from the market. So my advice is stay away from the markets. So, don't do that. And to what to read, there are so many things to read, but more important question to ask is what to not read. There's a lot of noise. The amount of information that is out there is increasing sort of exponentially, and what's really important in that is so small, getting smaller in percentage terms. So you have to have filters to remove what doesn't make sense, which is nonsensical or which is irrelevant. And almost everything is irrelevant. There are very few things that are really relevant to determining the competitive advantage of a business or the likely prosperity of the business. And that kind of gets drowned out by all the cacophony that you get. So there are all kinds of media sources that I would advise people to stay away from. Social media is one of them, by the way. I mean, there is an aspect of social media which is very helpful because you can use it to teach and you can make friends and build networks with people who can help you understand something. But to find out who is doing what and what they are buying and what they are selling, all that kind of gossip stuff, I would avoid that completely. Whether it's WhatsApp or Facebook or Twitter, or it doesn't matter which medium. Similarly, I don't want to read the front pages of any newspaper because that's basically something that is monumental right now but will most likely be irrelevant just a few years from now or a few months from now, even a few weeks from now. And you only have to pick up an old newspaper, maybe as old as 2 months old, to see how the point that I'm making here. And but the main meat, so to speak, is in the business stories, the interviews of the entrepreneurs, or some wonderful columnists who write cutting articles, very important articles, interesting articles with a lot of cutting analysis in them about a certain industry, about a certain entrepreneur, the challenges that are faced by that company or that entrepreneur, and how he or she has encountered them over the years. You learn more about industries or businesses by reading that stuff. So I would read business interviews. I would read detailed long-form analysis of companies done by independent journalists who have no, incentive to give a view one way or the other, who are really pursuing truth. So I don't like to read sell-side research for that reason. Read some of them because they have the sell-side guys. They probably have more knowledge about the domain, and if I want to learn about a domain, I'll go to them, but only after I've done my own work. But not to read about their views. I will read credit rating companies' report, but I have no interest in what the rating methodology is, what reviews are, how they decide whether to give it this rating or that. No interest in that, but there is data in there, which is not available in the annual report, because the companies are supposed to speak to them and give them information about things like customer concentration risk, or the order book, or the debt restructuring schedule, or something like that. There are all kinds of things that a lot of companies don't provide you in a sort of granular manner in the annual reports, but you find it in credit rating reports. I'll read those. So there are things that I know which I will absolutely not read, but there are only a few things that I would like to read.
So you just quoted in the recent talk that getting out of a bad investment is the tuition one pays for an investment education. So how does one differentiate between a bad investment from a temporary fit of Mr. Market?
Time will tell you, because if it's temporary, it will resolve, right? Obviously, you believe that the problem is temporary. If it was, then it will go back, right? Go back up. If it doesn't, then something is wrong. You got to know what is wrong, and you look at the evidence more objectively, which is what I was talking about a few minutes ago when we were in the classroom. That we don't look at evidence objectively. We don't think like Bayesians. We don't change our minds frequently enough. We don't like to change our views. We are very fixated in our views, and this happens a lot, especially when you have invested in it and there's a commitment bias, and you've gone on record speaking nicely about that company or the business or the entrepreneur. And it's very hard to change your mind because it looks like you have egg on your face. But better have egg on your face than to lose a lot of money, right?
So, on one of your blogs that I was reading, I read that you write about the quality of being extremely passive after investing in a quality stock, right?
Yeah.
So, could you elaborate how, like for our generation who's very fast and who loses patience with like making investments soon, how do we develop this quality of being passive after we've invested in a company?
Well, I don't want you to lose your impulsiveness, because the big part of being a young person is the thrill of being impulsive, right? So I don't see any reason why you should give up your impulsive behavior if you have it. It's only over a period of years that you will, it sort of will go away on its own if you are more reflective over the years. So that's one part of it. But if you really hell-bent on it, then I will challenge you to think about what makes a quality business and what makes a quality change. A quality business, whatever the attributes are, they don't change very quickly, right? So a great business is unlikely to become a bust company in a matter of a quarter or so, right? It doesn't happen. It shouldn't happen, right? So the change in the quality of a business, even if it's a great business, it becomes a mediocre business, it happens over a very long period of time. So what's the point of being so hyperactive? So by the way, this applies only to situations when you are investing in quality, because your question was about quality. If you are doing mediocre businesses, then you have to have much more faster action. In the portfolio, you have to get in, get out. If you're doing cyclicals, you have to do that. If you're doing risk arbitrage, you have to do that. If you're doing day trading, then we know what you have to do. And if you're doing high frequency, then also we know. So the churn ratio or the holding periods are a function of the kind of investing you're doing. And by no means do I want to say that people are doing high frequency and not value investors. Some of them are really doing very nice value investing by even doing high frequency trading. So it all depends on the kind of investing you're doing. If you're doing quality investing, then it requires you to have patience.
Right. So how have your thoughts on investing changed over time, and could you share some examples?
Well, I used to do a lot of risk arbitrage. When I came back from England, I was building my career in value investing, and I came across a number of situations where you could make 3-4% a month non-directional bets without taking a lot of risk. And I found it very exciting. You make 3 or 4% in a month, and if you do analyzation of those and analyze those returns, they look like really, really nice, right?
Yeah.
Those 50-60% annualized returns look very nice, but they don't show up in the portfolio, because the money goes out and it comes back, and then it sits there for a while, waiting for the next deal.
Yeah.
So when it sits there, it is earning 2, 3, 4, 5%, whatever.
Yeah.
So while it was out, it was earning a high IRR, but it was out for only 3 days or 10 days or 15 days. You're not doing a buyback, or you're doing a kind of a special dividend stripping operation. So all kinds of things that I've done, but the IRRs are good, the holding periods were small, and they were long holding periods where you didn't earn much.
Right.
So at the end of the year, you think, how much have I made? It wasn't a lot of money, but the IRRs look beautiful. So I became quite aware over time about the importance of reinvestment risk. I learned over time that the temptation of investing in something which will make you a 40% IRR versus something that will make you a 20% IRR. But if the 20% IRR can last with you, can stay with you for 10 years, is going to do a lot of good to you compared to the 40% IRR thing. And the temptation of the time is to say that I'll do the 40% right now, when the money comes back, then I'll do the 20% one. But it's not going to wait for you. It's either or. So opportunities don't wait around. If you get a chance to find something that will compound your money at a rate that makes you comfortable for a long time, that is almost certainly much more attractive than investing in something that will make you a lot of money in a very short period of time. Because when money comes back, you will be exposed to reinvestment risk. So that was one big lesson that I learned the hard way. The other big lesson that I learned the hard way was the pain of selling out of a great company too early. And I've done that a few times. And it really hurts to see that you made 3x and then it went up another 30x after that. That's very, very painful. So when I moved away from arbitrage to bargain securities to higher quality businesses, I realized the importance of reinvestment risk and the pain of selling too early. But of course, the pain of selling too early must be offset once in a while from the pain of not selling and seeing the price go down, and that also happens. So your life will never be full of, never be error free. You will always be making mistakes. If you don't make mistakes of omission, you will make mistakes of commission. If you or the other one, it's one way or the other. You cannot avoid a life full of mistakes. It will not happen.
I think building upon that, I think a question that at least I personally engage with a lot, and I think a lot of people in my generation engage with, is how do you deal with these mistakes? Let's say you've started off with something and you made a loss, and how do you deal with that loss?
So that's a good question that you're asking, and I talk about it in my behavioral finance courses. You see, losses. We have a trick called framing. You frame something in one way, you get one response. You frame something in another way, you get one response. Now you've had a loss. I'm not going to go into the details of framing. It's a little detailed topic, but to the extent that I want to talk about framing in the current context is as follows. You had a loss. You realize that you made a mistake. So you've got to move on, and you have to basically try to not make the same mistake again. So the way I think about it is I just reframe into what I call as the tuition fees. That I quantify the loss, and I write a note to myself that this is the fees that I paid. It should hurt, and it's really hurting, right? I made a mistake, and it's really hurting. And I write a note, and the pain is on the paper, and I quantify the fees, and I atone. And I say, I'm not going to do this again. I'm not going to make this kind of mistake again. And that kind of method has been helpful to me. I'm not saying that I haven't made those mistakes again. That would be dishonest. But I made fewer of those mistakes because I confessed to myself and I quantified the number and I framed it as a tuition fee. Because framing it as a tuition fee helps me move on. Because otherwise you keep, being miserable about the whole thing. That you made so much and you didn't sell and it's come down, or you shouldn't have bought it in the first place and it's gone down way below your cost. Whatever the case. Whether it is a real cost or an opportunity cost, it costs. It hurts either way. Of course, real losses are more painful than opportunity losses, but they're painful nevertheless. And one way to, but the way I deal with it is to just frame it internally as a tuition fees.
Right. So the last question was really, what do you consider to be the scope for fundamental analysis in a market that's being highly computerized and run by algorithms?
See, any business which thrives, think of fundamental analysts as a group of businessmen, right? Now, in any industry, you need a competitive advantage, right? And you need to do well over time. And investing is a industry with low entry barriers. Anybody can enter the industry. So fundamental analysis is not different from any other kind of analysis, whether it is algorithmic trading or technical analysis or day trading or arbitrage or investing into bargain securities or doing activism. I mean, there are like 20 other strategies that you could think of, but every one of them has low entry barriers. And entry barriers are coming down. People are able to. People thought that they couldn't do activism, but now there are activist funds.
Right.
So they will make it easy for any investor to participate in an activist fund. There are long short funds, there are arbitrage funds. So any kind of activity, if it is profitable, you have to assume that it will be mean reverting. That if it attracts a lot of competition, the returns will go down. It's inevitable. I mean, you may not like it, but it's inevitable. So whether fundamental analysis will become less profitable over time, it's obvious that if you keep doing it the same way, which is easy for others to copy, then, and there are aspects of the fundamental analysis that can be automated, then the machines are going to beat you, because they're beating you on so many parameters and activities already, and the change is so rapid and exponential that there's no way you can compete with machines. So it's very similar in that sense, that if you are a doctor and you are into diagnosis and you're looking at data and you're processing the data in your head, and a computer could do it better than you. Maybe not right now, Watson is not as good as people thought, but I don't want to bet against Watson or something like that in the next 10 years. It's not a bet that I want to make. I think they will do better than the humans. So anything that can be, which requires processing of information and thinking about historical patterns, computers can do way better than you. I mean, we've seen that in games, right? So no point even fighting them on that. So I don't want to fight them. It's about finding new ways of looking at data which is hard for computers to look at. And there are aspects of fundamental analysis where I think that there's still an edge. For example, investing with the right kind of person who has the right kind of mix between the ability to take risk and still not blow up the company. So he takes calculated bets.
Okay.
And you know about that person only by engaging with that person. At least my view is that you learn about it, about how he thinks about risk. Computers are not going to be finding it easy to be able to do, at least not yet. But human interaction with the person will tell you a lot about how he thinks about risk and how he thinks about dependence, for example, dependence on a single vendor or dependence on a single product or a single factory. How he talks about it, how he worries about it, how he wants to do things to reduce his dependence on something that makes the business fragile. So you can get to learn a lot about the philosophy of the person by engaging with the person, by spending time with the person, or by reading through the literature that he has published over the last 10, 15, 20 years. And I don't think computers are really that good right now to be able to get that right. That was one. The other one was something that I was talking about in the classroom, that you want to invest with people who can make the right trade-offs between the R and the N on the compound interest formula, and who don't give in to instant gratification, who can take near-term pain, but there is a lot of long-term gain down the road. Now there are a lot of business models where there is a lot of near-term pain, like e-commerce in India, for example, but they don't have the capacity to suffer. They don't have the wherewithal to stay. They don't have their own money. They have to depend on the kindness of strangers. They have to keep raising more and more capital and burn that capital to build a loyal customer base. Whether they'll succeed or not, I don't know. But if it was your own money and if you had incredible patience and if you create loyal customers who will give you a bigger and bigger part of your wallet over the years, like Jeff Bezos has achieved, then finding those people who have taken care of the downside risk because they don't have a lot of leverage or dependence on outside capital versus extreme patience, that those kind of people are, I think, easier to be spotted as of now by human beings than by algorithms, I guess. So there's an edge. Still, I have some hope for fundamental analysis.
Alright. So, on that, we'd like to conclude the interview. And thank you so much for doing this, Professor. It means a lot to us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Okay, all the best.